Welcome back to the deep dive. History is full of these figures kind of shrouded in mystery and contradiction.
Yeah.
And today we're diving into one such King James VI and I.
Okay.
Imagine, growing up and believing your mother is your sworn enemy,
Right.
facing this, relentless pressure to be the ideal ruler and just battling constant court intrigue.
Oh, yeah.
That was Jones's reality.
It's true. And it's those very experiences that make him such a captivating figure, to study.
Exactly. Today, we're unpacking excerpts from this fascinating interview with Dr. Stephen Virapin, author of The Wisest Fool, The Lavish Life of James VI and I.
Right.
And we'll go beyond the surface and uncover how his personal life, fears, desires, shaped his reign, and ultimately impacted the course of history.
Yeah, it's an intriguing journey, one that reveals how his childhood experiences, profoundly impacted his character.
Absolutely. Many remember James as kind of an eccentric figure, often mocked in popular culture.
Huh.
But before we jump into those perceptions, let's rewind a bit and look at the man behind the crown.
A great place to start is with that famous label, the wisest fool in Christendom, right? It's a
Yeah.
contradiction that kind of highlights the complexity of his character. He was a man of immense learning who wrote, extensively on topics from demonology to political theory.
Yet he was also known for his lavish spending habits,
Mhm.
fear of witches, and kind of tumultuous personal relationships.
Right.
It begs the question, how do we reconcile these seemingly opposing traits?
Yeah, Dr. Virapin suggests that to understand James, we need to go back to his childhood. His upbringing was anything but ordinary, even for a royal, I mean.
Well, he was the son of Mary Queen of Scots, which in itself sets the stage for a dramatic start to life.
Precisely. But what's often overlooked is the fact that James was essentially raised to despise his own mother.
Right.
Remember, this was a time of intense religious and political turmoil.
Right. The Scottish Reformation was in full swing, and James was being molded into the ideal Protestant king, a stark contrast to his Catholic mother.
Exactly. He was separated from her at a young age and actively encouraged to see her as his enemy,
Wow.
politically and religiously. Imagine the psychological impact of that. Having your own mother painted as a threat to your very existence.
That's a lot for a young child to process.
Uh-huh.
And as if that wasn't enough, his education was an experiment in itself.
Led by the brilliant but extremely strict George Buchanan, who believed in using harsh discipline to instill knowledge.
I've heard stories of James being terrified of Buchanan years after his tutoring ended.
Really?
Yeah. Imagine encountering someone who instills such fear in you as a child.
Yeah.
It speaks volumes about the impact of those formative years.
It's clear that this rigorous, almost isolated upbringing shaped his personality and his view of the world.
Right.
He was constantly surrounded by older, ambitious men who sought to influence him, to mold him to their own purposes.
It brings us to another fascinating parallel Dr. Virapin draws. The comparison between young James and the young Elizabeth I. Both were essentially groomed by older, manipulative figures. In James's case, it was his cousin Esme Stuart.
Yes, and what's interesting about Esme Stuart is that he recognized and possibly exploited James's need for affection, even his potential bisexuality.
Wow.
It was a manipulation tactic, using James's emotional vulnerabilities for personal gain.
It's a reminder that even kings, particularly young and impressionable ones, are susceptible to such manipulation. It makes you think about the lasting impact these early experiences had on James's future relationships.
Precisely. Dr. Virapin argues that this dynamic might have shaped James's later desire to seek out those he could control, educate, and mold, almost like a paternal figure seeking surrogate sons.
It's fascinating to see how those early power dynamics might have played out in his later relationships. But before we delve into those, let's talk about the woman who became James's queen, Anna of Denmark.
Their relationship is often painted as a mismatch of intellects, with James, the scholar, and Anna, the frivolous queen. But Dr. Virapin challenges that simplistic narrative.
Yeah, he suggests that Anna was actually quite intelligent and politically astute, maybe even more so than James was comfortable with.
That's right. She was strong-willed, opinionated, and used her position to advocate for her own interests and those of her Danish family.
So she wasn't content to just be a silent figurehead by the king's side.
Absolutely not. She fought for control over her own household, disagreed with James on matters of policy, and even used her influence to secure positions for her supporters at court.
This definitely challenges the stereotypical image of the demure and subservient queen. What's fascinating is that despite this clash of personalities, James actually went to great lengths to win Anna's hand in marriage.
Yes. He even braved a perilous sea voyage to personally escort her back to Scotland. It seems that he was genuinely smitten with her, at least initially.
It seems like there's more to this story than a simple power play.
Well, remember that James's legitimacy as king was still somewhat precarious, after his mother's execution.
Right.
A strategic marriage to a European princess would solidify his position and demonstrate his power on the international stage.
So it was a combination of love, ambition, and political maneuvering.
Yeah.
But even with a grand romantic gesture like sailing across the sea for his bride, it seems things weren't always smooth sailing between them.
Their clashes highlight not only their individual personalities, but also the broader societal expectations and power dynamics, between men and women at the time.
Which brings us to another fascinating aspect of James's reign, his deep fascination with witchcraft.
This was a period of heightened anxiety and fear surrounding witchcraft across Europe. And James, having witnessed accusations of witchcraft in Denmark, brought those fears back to Scotland with him.
So this obsession was fueled by personal experiences as well as the prevailing beliefs of the time.
Exactly. And remember, James was a scholar, deeply interested in theology and demonology. He even wrote a treatise on witchcraft, Demonology, outlining his beliefs and advocating for the prosecution of witches.
It's chilling to think how one man's beliefs, however sincerely held, could have such devastating consequences for so many, particularly women, who are often targeted as scapegoats.
It certainly underscores the dangers of unchecked authority and how fear, combined with religious fervor, can be manipulated for political gain.
It's a stark reminder that the past isn't some romanticized fairy tale. It's filled with complexities, darkness, and difficult truths.
And speaking of difficult truths, we need to address the other side of James's wisest fool label, his political maneuvering.
Right. When James ascended to the English throne in 1603, there was a lot of optimism surrounding his arrival. He was seen as a learned Protestant king who would bring stability and unity to the realm after Elizabeth's long reign.
But as Dr. Virapin points out, that initial honeymoon period was relatively short-lived.
What were some of the factors that contributed to this disillusionment?
Well, James, despite presenting himself as the continuity candidate, quickly ran into trouble on the religious front. Both Catholics and Puritan Protestants hoped for concessions, for changes that would align with their beliefs.
But instead of embracing change, James essentially doubled down on the existing religious policies, further solidifying the Church of England.
Exactly. He believed that maintaining religious stability was crucial for preserving peace and order in the realm. But this decision alienated groups on both ends of the religious spectrum, creating simmering tensions that would eventually erupt in the English Civil War.
So, in trying to maintain the status quo, he inadvertently planted the seeds of future conflict.
It's a classic example of how even the best intentions can backfire, when they fail to consider the complexities of the situation.
Right.
And then there was the issue of James's extravagant spending habits. He and Anna had a lavish lifestyle, which contrasted sharply with Elizabeth's frugality.
They weren't afraid to throw a good party.
They saw it as a way to demonstrate the power and grandeur of the new dynasty. However, this lavish spending quickly led them into debt and created friction with Parliament, who controlled the purse strings.
So the party couldn't last forever.
Not without consequences. James's clashes with Parliament over finances revealed a deeper tension, the struggle between the Crown's authority and the growing power of the legislature.
It was a conflict that would continue to play out for generations to come, ultimately shaping the political landscape of England.
And to complicate matters further, there was the issue of James's close relationships with his male favorites.
Ah, yes. The infamous relationships that fueled whispers and scandals. Let's start with Robert Carr, the Earl of Somerset. What was it about Carr that captivated James's attention?
Well, Carr was undeniably handsome, but according to Dr. Virapin, there was a deeper psychological element at play. Remember how James's early experiences shaped his desire to be a mentor, a teacher?
Yes, that longing to shape and mold someone younger?
Well, Carr, having been injured in a riding accident, presented himself as someone in need of guidance and protection.
So this vulnerability, this need to be cared for, might have triggered James's paternal instincts.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that this incident happened during a tournament held to celebrate James's accession to the English throne.
So in a way, Carr's vulnerability was juxtaposed against the backdrop of James's newfound power and authority.
Precisely. It was a complex dynamic, one that might have intensified James's feelings of protectiveness towards Carr.
And how did Queen Anna react to this new favorite entering the picture?
Not well, to say the least. She deeply resented Carr, viewing him as a threat to her own influence and a source of humiliation. He openly disrespected her, flaunting his power and mocking her behind her back.
That had to be incredibly frustrating for her.
It was a power struggle, playing out in the very heart of the court, with the king caught in the middle.
And this brings us to the infamous Overbury murder case.
Ah, yes, the scandal that rocked the English court. Can you remind us what happened? When Carr decided to marry Frances Howard, a woman already entangled in a scandalous marriage, his friend and secretary, Thomas Overbury, objected.
Oh, right.
He warned Carr that this marriage would lead to his downfall.
And Overbury ended up mysteriously dead in the Tower of London, right?
That's right. It turned out that Frances Howard was behind the poisoning, and the whole affair exposed the dark underbelly of court intrigue and the lengths to which people would go to protect their power and reputation.
It must have been a huge blow to James, seeing his beloved favorite embroiled in such a scandal.
It was. And ultimately, Carr and Frances Howard were found guilty and banished from court. This marked the end of Carr's reign as James's favorite and paved the way for a new figure to enter the scene, George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham.
Villiers is an interesting character as well. What drew James to him?
Like Carr, Villiers was incredibly handsome and charming. But unlike Carr, he was also politically savvy and understood the importance of cultivating a good relationship with Queen Anna.
So he learned from Carr's mistakes and played the game a little more strategically.
Exactly. He knew that to secure his position, he needed to have the Queen on his side. And James, always susceptible to flattery and charm, was quickly smitten.
It seems like Villiers fit perfectly into James's desire for a close-knit, almost familial atmosphere at court, something he'd lacked in his own childhood.
That's a key insight from Dr. Virapin. He suggests that James's relationships with his favorites, while undoubtedly romantic and sexual in nature, were also driven by this deep-seated longing for familial intimacy.
It's another layer of complexity to these relationships and to James's character as a whole. He was a man of contradictions, a scholar and a sensualist, a peacemaker and a persecutor of witches, a king who craved both power and affection.
And those very contradictions are what make him such a fascinating subject to study.
Now, after exploring all these facets of his life, I'm curious to revisit that label that's followed James throughout history, the wisest fool in Christendom. What are your thoughts on this assessment?
Dr. Virapin offers a fascinating perspective on this. He suggests flipping the saying on its head, arguing that James was actually quite wise when it came to big-picture issues like religion and war.
Oh, that's interesting. So he was wise in the grand scheme of things, but perhaps less so in the day-to-day details of governing.
Exactly. For example, James was a staunch advocate for peace, having witnessed the devastating effects of war firsthand. He believed in diplomacy and negotiation, which was arguably a wise stance considering the constant conflicts raging across Europe at the time.
So that's an example of his wisdom on a grand scale.
Hmm.
But what about the instances where he might have been considered foolish?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, he was notorious for his extravagant spending, which landed him in debt and created tension with Parliament.
Right.
He could be incredibly penny-wise yet pound-foolish, failing to grasp the long-term financial consequences of his actions.
So he was a visionary in some respects, but lacked practical financial management skills.
That's one way to put it. And he also had a tendency to neglect the day-to-day grind of governing, often leaving much of the work to his overworked secretaries.
Sounds like he was a big-picture thinker, but struggled with the nitty-gritty details of running a kingdom.
It's a very human flaw, even for a king. And it reminds us that even the most intelligent people can have blind spots and weaknesses.
And it highlights the limitations of those sweeping historical judgments. Calling someone the wisest fool oversimplifies a complex character, reducing them to a catchy soundbite.
Exactly. It's by digging deeper, exploring the nuances of their lives and decisions, that we can truly begin to understand these historical figures.
And appreciate the fact that history is rarely black and white. It's full of contradictions, complexities, and those fascinating shades of gray that make it so captivating.
Absolutely. And speaking of captivating, there's one final aspect of James's life we need to address: his relationships with his male favorites. This is where the personal and the political truly collide, revealing the complexities of power, desire, and court intrigue.
These relationships are obviously controversial at the time, and they've continued to fascinate historians for centuries. What can we glean from these relationships about James as a person, as a ruler?
Well, it's crucial to understand the context of the time. While same-sex relationships existed, they weren't openly acknowledged or accepted in the same way they are today.
Right, so expressing these relationships openly would have been incredibly risky, for a king especially, one who was already facing scrutiny.
Absolutely. And that's why these relationships were often veiled in secrecy and, disguised as close friendships or mentorship, right?
Right.
But even with those precautions, they still caused quite a stir at court.
It seems like Queen Anna in particular was not pleased with these favorites vying for the king's attention.
She wasn't. As we discussed earlier, Anna was a strong-willed woman who wasn't afraid to assert herself. She saw these favorites as rivals for James's affection and political influence.
Right. It must have been incredibly difficult for her to navigate those dynamics, especially within the confines of court life where appearances were everything.
It was a constant balancing act. She had to maintain a certain level of decorum as queen while also protecting her own interests and those of her children.
So these relationships weren't just personal matters, they had real political implications.
They did. The favorites often held positions of power and influence, which led to accusations of corruption and favoritism. Their rivals would use these relationships to undermine their authority and discredit them in the eyes of the court.
So it sounds like a tangled web of intrigue, ambition, and personal drama.
It was. And it's important to remember that we're looking at these events through the lens of history, filtered through the biases and agendas of those who wrote about them.
Right, so it's always a challenge to separate fact from fiction.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to something as personal and potentially scandalous as same-sex relationships in a royal court.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to consider multiple perspectives, to look at the evidence carefully, and to avoid making, simplistic judgments about historical figures.
Well said. After this deep dive into the life and reign of James VI and I think it's safe to say he was far more complex than those simple labels like the wisest fool suggest.
I agree. He was a man of contradictions, a product of his time, yet also an individual who defied easy categorization. He was a scholar who believed in witchcraft, a peace-loving king who presided over a surge in religious persecution, a ruler who craved both absolute power and intimate companionship.
It's those very contradictions, those human flaws and complexities that make him such a fascinating figure to study.
Absolutely. And by exploring those contradictions, we gain a deeper understanding not only of James himself, but also of the broader historical forces at play during his reign.
We see how personal experiences shaped political decisions, how religious beliefs impacted social norms, and how the struggle for power played out on both a grand and intimate scale.
It's a reminder that history is not a collection of dry facts and dates, but a living tapestry woven from the lives, choices, and passions of real people.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm feeling like I need to read Dr. Virapin's book now. This deep dive has given me a whole new perspective on James VI and I.
I highly recommend it. It's a wonderfully insightful and engaging read that will challenge your assumptions and leave you wanting to learn more about this intriguing king.
And that's what the deep dive is all about. Sparking curiosity, encouraging you to explore new ideas, and maybe even challenge your own perspectives along the way.
Exactly. So until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains buzzing.
And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more fascinating explorations into history, science, culture, and the myriad of topics that make us human.